World History, Chapter 26. We're going on to Communism in China. We're going to be talking about the communists versus the nationalists and how communists took over China and how the Chinese people were betrayed by the United States. Here's some pictures here, and you see the pictures of Mao Zedong, the communist leader that took over. And in the midst of all this, hundreds of thousands of people were actually murdered to bring communism into China. So let us begin with this story. The communists versus the nationalists, okay? So who were the communists and who were the nationalists? One of the greatest disasters for the cause of freedom was the communist takeover of China. Of course, communism limits freedoms. China had become a republic in 1911. In about a decade, which is 10 years later, communist forces tried to take control. But the Chinese government at this time was able to prevent this takeover. Then in 1927, civil war broke out between the nationalists, led by a Christian statesman, Chiang Kai-shek. You can see the picture of Chiang Kai-shek there in the right-hand corner. And so as the nationalists running the country at the time, the communists then led by Mao Zedong and causing this civil war. But the civil war in China was interrupted by the Japanese invasion of China in 1937, which was the pre-invasion to the war as Japan entered World War II and the bombing of Pearl Harbor in America. But before that, Japan was attacking China. And so Mao's communists did little fighting against the Japanese. Instead, they were organizing their own civil war to overcome the nationalists of China. The nationalist government was a very free enterprise, similar to the United States. And of course, the communist government was very similar to the communist government that appeared in Russia under Stalin, Joseph Stalin, and Lenin at that time. So here we have some pictures of the communists versus the nationalists. The Chinese nationalists were exhausted after World War II. So, of course, World War II was fought. Japan was attacking China. So the communists during this time of China rested. The communists rested after the exhausting civil war and concentrated on gaining support among the Chinese peasants, while the nationalists were fighting in World War II against Japan. So following Japan's defeat, the civil war continued, went back to the same old, where Mao Zedong was attacking the nationalists of Chiang Kai-shek. His picture in the corner of this side with Chiang Kai-shek here, what was going on. So there were 18 years of war, while Mao's communists were well rested, and plus they were armed by the Soviet Union. That means Russia was providing them with guns and ammunition and things like that. So, of course, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists had just fought this big war against Japan, and they were exhausted. Mao had advantages as controlled Manchuria. You see, Manchuria was a big section of China that the Soviets seized and gave to the communists. And so Mao had this section. Manchuria had abundant resources and a thriving population and industry. And Mao Zedong, the communist, controlled this stronghold of 40 million people. So, of course, the communists had support from Russia at this time. Now we see how China was betrayed. Well, the United States had supported Chiang Kai-shek. He was a Christian leader. They supported him before the war, before World War II, and during the war. But after the war, they betrayed him. The liberal journalists, at that time, there was a move of socialism actually in the United States, and they promoted Mao Zedong and said, oh, he was an agrarian reformer and a true man of the people. Little did they know that he was killing hundreds of thousands of people. So, and Chiang Kai-shek was portrayed as a corrupt and power-hungry man. In December of 1945, the United States General then was George C. Marshall. Remember, he was actually involved in the European helping Europe after the war, the Reconstruction. But now he traveled to China, and his purpose was to arrange peace at that time between the nationalists and the communists. But he was unable to bring a lasting peace. Why? Well, Chiang Kai-shek refused the compromise, knowing that if he would compromise with Mao Zedong, this would produce a communist government. And Chiang was a nationalist. He was against communism coming into China. So George Marshall from the United States imposed an arms embargo on the nationalists, which sealed their doom, basically saying that the embargo would be against nationalists, and now the United States would not support Chiang Kai-shek. So here's some pictures. It's a picture of in the right-hand corner there of a young Mao Zedong, and then we see Chiang Kai-shek here, and a statue here of Chiang Kai-shek. See how big that statue is right there with the small, and that's in basically the statues in Taiwan there. So today, so let's go on. The People's Republic of China now. So without American aid, Chiang Kai-shek and his forces were unable to hold back Mao Zedong and his communists, who were armed and supported by Russia, as I said before. In 1948, the communists launched powerful offensives at that time, and the last national stronghold fell in May of 1949. So May of 1949, the nationalists lost the war to the communists. Chiang Kai-shek and 2 million of his soldiers, with their families, were forced to flee to the island of Taiwan. So you can see that picture there of the island of Taiwan. There you see China, and then you'll see the tiny island. You can see comparison to the huge Chinese country, and where they had to retreat. And today, even Taiwan is a free enterprise country, a democratic country, and not communist. And even today, Taiwan is being threatened by communist China. On October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China. And this nation of the most populated people, with the most people, had been overrun by communists. The United States had deserted a friend in need. Indeed, I should say, the United States deserted Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists and let China be taken over by communism. See in these pictures. Excuse me. China under communism. Revolution begins. Mao Zedong set out to make China into the world's greatest communist state. You see in these pictures. He followed Lenin and Stalin in Russia. Mao began what's called social engineering. Very ugly process in social engineering. Social engineering actually was eliminated any threat to his regime, but it would make a lot of people suffer, especially farmers. The first to suffer would be the Chinese farmers, because they were denounced as enemies of the people. Their land was taken away to give to the communist state. The middle-class farmers, any middle class, the farmers and businesses would become target of mass arrests and execution. So if you were middle class, you would possibly be executed, especially if you did not agree with the communist state taking away your business and taking away your farms. The lands of the farmers were confiscated by the state. They were taken by the state, and they were murdered. The farmers were murdered or made to be slaves. This was called genocide. That means totally mass genocide of people, of a certain class of people, which would be the middle class. Mao's destruction caused agriculture to plummet down to nothing. So suddenly, you can imagine, Mao came in and took over the farms. Well, he brought as for the food from the farms, he brought them into the cities, leaving millions of people in that area to starve to death. So you could say probably hundreds, millions, when you think of millions of people dying. Not just hundreds of thousands, millions. Mao's 5-year plan in 1953. So he had a plan to implement communism. And in his 5-year plan, he's going to make them China a great country. He wanted to make it produce economically and make it into one of the greatest countries actually in the whole world. And Mao's idea of the 5-year plan would be China's industrial output would be increased at the rapid rate of 15%, which it did at first, but the cost of human lives was staggering. People were forced to work in the factories, and children were forced to work. So Mao turned the collective farming and forced the peasants in all of their small landholdings into the large agricultural cooperatives. So basically the government owned all of the peasants' farms, and they had nothing. So they had to depend on food from the government, as in most other communist countries. So like it's pictured on here, how Mao Zedong is shaking Joseph Stalin from Russia. Both of them, murderers and terrible dictators of communism, and you see them agreeing on their policies. The end justifies the means, and the means meant killing and murdering millions of people. Mao's great leap forward was the next 5 years. So the first 5 years was his 5-year plan, and in 1958 his second 5-year plan was called the Great Leap Forward, in which he wanted to basically leap forward in his economy, which wouldn't happen. Mao was convinced the communist ideology, the communist belief, could overcome all obstacles. So he really believed in it. But the Great Leap Forward was a huge failure. Productivity declined as millions of unskilled workers toiled for long hours without modern tools and very primitive working conditions, not good conditions. He was working his people to death, and he had totally controlled and basically controlling them and children and all to work for the government, right? That was his great leap forward. Agricultural output on collective farms fell so drastically that as many as 15 million people starved to death. Can you believe that? 15 million people starved to death under his great leap forward? I would say that would be a great leap backward, wouldn't you? It's pretty sickening. Foreign affairs. So throughout the Cold War we know is of communism, China demonstrated its aggressive nature toward its neighbors. How did China do this? Well, Chinese troops became involved in the Korean War, 80 communist revolutionaries against South Korea. So basically China wanted, and Mao Zedong wanted the Chinese communists to spread to all other nations, conquering the world. In 1954 and 1958, Chinese troops clashed with forces from India, and forcibly seized some territories with India, and India's bordering, so they were fighting with India too. And then Mao, he resented Khrushchev. When Stalin died, Mao loved Joseph Stalin. Remember, Stalin was a terrible mass murderer, but Mao wasn't really behind Khrushchev, the next ruler, so much, because Khrushchev said he was de-Stalinizing Russia, and he announced. So Mao announced that he had betrayed the World War Communist Revolution, because Mao Zedong believed in Joseph Stalin, Stalin's ways, and Khrushchev, de-Stalinization is not what Mao said was true communism. So the Soviet Union cut off economic aid to China altogether. And so now the Chinese and the Russia were at odds with each other, right? By 1963, the Soviets and Communist China were completely severed from each other. Then happened what's called the Cultural Revolution. Well, in 1966, Mao decided to launch a full-scale cultural revolution to purge China of all what he called counterfeit revolutionaries and any foreign influence. So he wanted nothing to do, no influence from the West at all. And so anyone that came against Mao Zedong was basically put to death or put in prison. So this was encouraged by the Communist Party, of course, and students and young people then started forming gangs called the Red Guards. So now we have, what we're having with the Cultural Revolution is the young people, they have their own form of communism now, and they're pretty much splitting with some of the old ways of Mao. And the Red Guards, they infiltrated the city streets with demonstrations and marches and protests, and they attacked Chinese professionals and intellectuals too. So here we have a split, but the split is going to be, of course, communism needs to be united as to even be able to sustain itself. So that violence happened then between those young communists and the older communists that were following Mao. So the violence was so widespread that Mao had to call on the army to subdue and restore order. So now we have this whole, violent revolution going on in China. In 1970, the Cultural Revolution had ended, but thousands had been killed and millions more had been beaten up and terrorized, and many buildings, homes, and property had been vandalized or destroyed. So, man, both sides, as for communism there, it's not working. Let's just say that. China after Mao. Mao Zedong died in 1976. The death toll of his reign of terror was far above 40 million people. Can you imagine that? This is the worst massacre in world history. He had killed 40 million people. You think of the Holocaust, there were 6 million people, as for the 6 million Jews killed. Now he killed 40 million people. Anyone that disagreed, and all of the middle class, and any Christian would be killed. After Mao's death, a power struggle began now. So in 1980, Deng Xiaoping, or Xiaoping, I think that's how you say, emerged as Communist China's most powerful leader, and China remained in the cruel clutches of communist oppression. So Deng Xiaoping, I don't speak very good Chinese, but anyway, he took over in the midst of all what was going on after Mao. So we're going to stop there, and we're going to go on to the Korean War, but that's kind of a sad history of China.